A number of years ago, ACTRIMS sponsored a group that was ultimately called the Differential Diagnosis Consortium. Um, and in the end, we had over 50 MS specialist neurologists who worked on a variety of projects to help clinicians in practice navigate MS differential diagnosis. Um, I would say that, over the last decade or two, we learned a lot more about the diseases that can mimic MS. We've increasingly recognized new diseases that can present with syndromes that are quite similar to MS. And we've also recognized that a lot of disorders get misdiagnosed as MS, and that misdiagnosis is a pervasive problem. All these changes over the last 10 or 20 years have really driven this effort to sort of update clinicians on maybe best practice approaches to considering other diagnoses when thinking about MS. Right now, MS doesn't have a highly specific or sensitive biomarker. There's not one test that we can just do and say, yes, this is MS with high accuracy. So this concept of no better explanation has been part of our diagnostic criteria, for half a century or so. And what this means is not that if you see somebody and they have neurologic symptoms or abnormalities in an MRI and you don't have a better explanation, maybe it's MS. It really means that, you have somebody in front of you who may fulfill MS diagnostic criteria, but we also still need to make sure there's no red flags or something that points towards a better explanation other than MS. The diagnostic process should be thinking about our diagnostic criteria and making sure that patients fulfill that criteria, but also considering other diagnoses that can mimic MS along the way. So the ACTRIMS Differential Diagnosis Consortium efforts ultimately yielded 4 collaborative papers published in Lancet Neurology and JAMA Neurology. Now, the first paper, what it does is takes people through what's typical for MS. The 2017 McDonald criteria require a syndrome typical for MS with objective evidence of a lesion as a starting point to make the diagnosis of MS, and all of our criteria have required that through the years. Things might change with the new criteria, but there's still a pathway to diagnose MS in somebody who has a typical syndrome that's likely to be shorter than somebody with something atypical. And it's important to realize what those terms mean. So those terms, typical and atypical, are all over our diagnostic criteria. And this first paper has a number of figures that highlight what may be considered atypical or typical for MS, particularly in the setting of specific syndromes that we think of as common in MS, such as optic neuritis or myelitis or brainstem syndromes. The first paper also has these comprehensive tables, collaboratively developed by many subspecialists in the field that highlight clinical findings or history when you're examining a patient that might suggest a disorder other than MS, or key imaging findings on MRI in particular that might point to a disorder other than MS. We have 3 other papers that are just as important as sort of the more comprehensive paper that really guide clinicians on MS differential diagnosis approaches in a variety of specific populations and regions. So the differential diagnosis in young patients or pediatric patients or older patients differs considerably from patients sort of in the middle age range. So we have one paper that focuses on children and older adults where the thinking may be different. The diseases that could mimic MS in those populations, the proportion of specific diseases that may mimic MS in those populations is quite different. That paper focuses on how to approach MS and differential diagnosis in pediatrics and older adults. The consortium also produced a paper that focuses specifically on people or potential patients from minority ethnic and racial backgrounds in North America, Northern Europe, and Australasia. Primarily because we have some data from those regions. And there are important considerations for differential diagnosis of MS and barriers to diagnosis of MS that were worth focusing on in those populations. And so this paper helps guide clinicians through MS differential diagnosis in patients of those populations in these particular regions. But the title of the paper is, sort of reflects that we really need more data. But there are different diseases that may be more prevalent in patients with certain ethnic or racial backgrounds that we really need to consider in particular regions. The last paper from the consortium is a bit broader. So we call the differential diagnosis of suspected multiple sclerosis global health considerations. And what this is really about is there are unique diseases in particular regions of the world that may mimic MS more frequently in those regions. For instance, infections or nutritional deficiencies. And there are also unique barriers to differential diagnosis evaluation in some of these regions that may be more resource limited. So while a lot of our literature in MS tends to be kind of focused from North America or Europe in particular, this is much more of a global scope of MS differential diagnosis considerations and approaches. So the idea was that clinicians in these regions, where healthcare resources and endemic infections differ quite considerably from regions like North America, there'd be sort of a paper that focused on syndromes and diagnoses that really should be considered. I think each of these four papers, individually and together, can really provide a valuable resource to clinicians in practice, subspecialists as well as non-specialists alike. There was a paper that sort of a similar group produced in 2008 that is still the most cited paper on MS differential diagnosis in the literature. So these are really an important update to that paper that's been used by so many clinicians and trainees over the years. If nothing else, the tables and the figures are quite comprehensive, and they're a very nice resource, especially when you have a patient in front of you and things are not clear cut, and as not a straightforward case of MS, or you have some questions about clinical or radiological features. I hope that these papers will be an important resource for practicing clinicians and trainees for many years to come.